Welcome to this lesson on security operations, workflows, and processes. In the previous lesson, we talked about SOC roles and tiers. So now we know who is responsible for what. But knowing the structure of a SOC is only part of the picture. We also need to understand what actually happens when an alert appears. How does an alert become an investigation? Who decides whether it is important? When should it be escalated? And how do we make sure that two analysts looking at the same type of activity follow roughly the same process? That is where security operations workflows come in. A workflow is basically a defined sequence of steps that moves security activity from detection to resolution. In a mature SOC, analysts should not simply investigate alerts however they personally prefer. There needs to be a repeatable process. Without that structure, one analyst might investigate an alert for 40 minutes, while another analyst closes the same type of alert after 2 minutes. You can also end up with duplicated investigations, unnecessary escalations, missing documentation, or important threats simply falling through the cracks. So, the goal of a standardized workflow is consistency. It gives analysts a common process regardless of who is working, what shift they are on, or how experienced they are. The workflow begins with detection. Before an alert exists, we have telemetry. That telemetry can come from endpoints, EDR platforms, identity systems, firewalls, cloud environments, email security solutions, network infrastructure, applications, and many other sources. ASIEM, or another detection platform, collects this information and applies detection logic to it. That could be a correlation rule, behavioral analytics, anomaly detection, or threat intelligence matching. When the required conditions are met, an alert is generated. But this is important. An alert is not the same thing as a confirmed security incident. An alert tells us that something happened which matches our detection logic and deserves attention. The analyst still needs to determine what that activity actually means. And because a SOC can receive hundreds or thousands of alerts, we cannot simply investigate everything in the order it arrives. That brings us to prioritization. Most SOC environments use some form of severity classification, such as critical, high, medium, and low. Critical alerts normally represent situations where immediate action may be required. Think about active ransomware behavior, confirmed data exfiltration, or evidence that a privileged account has been compromised and is actively being abused. High severity alerts can include things like suspicious lateral movement, malware execution on a business critical system, or large scale credential attacks. Medium severity alerts still require investigation, but usually within a defined SLA rather than immediately. Low severity alerts may represent low confidence anomalies, informational activity, or behavior that can be reviewed later or even handled automatically. But severity should never depend only on the name of the detection rule. Context matters. If suspicious PowerShell activity appears on a standard workstation, that is one situation. If the same activity appears on a domain controller and is executed using a highly privileged account, the risk is completely different. So we also need to consider asset criticality, user privileges, detection confidence, observed attacker behavior, and potential business impact. Another important concept here is risk-based alerting. Traditional alerting can create enormous amounts of noise because every suspicious event generates another alert. Imagine a user executes PowerShell. Then that user has an unusual login. Later, the same system communicates with a suspicious IP address. Individually, none of these events necessarily proves malicious activity, but when we correlate them together, the overall risk becomes much more interesting. Risk-based alerting allows platforms such as Splunk to assign risk to entities like users or hosts and accumulate that risk over time. When the combined behavior reaches a meaningful threshold, the platform can generate a higher quality alert. This is one of the ways SOC teams reduce alert fatigue. The goal is not simply to generate more alerts. The goal is to generate alerts that analysts can actually act on. Once an alert reaches the analyst, we move into triage. Triage is the rapid initial assessment of an alert. It is not supposed to be a complete forensic investigation. At this stage, the analyst is trying to answer a few basic questions. Is the alert legitimate? What system, user, or asset is involved? What is the potential impact? Is immediate containment required? And does this need to be escalated? The analyst first reviews the alert itself and validates that the underlying event data makes sense. Then we start gathering context. For an endpoint alert, I might pivot from the SIEM into the EDR platform and examine the process tree. I want to know which process started the suspicious process, what command line arguments were used, which user executed it, whether files were created or modified, and whether the endpoint established suspicious network connections. For an authentication alert, I might look at the source IP address, authentication history, device information, previous failed logins, geographical context, and whether the account has administrative privileges. Timestamps are also extremely important because individual events rarely tell the whole story. We often need to reconstruct a sequence of activity. Based on that evidence, the analyst classifies the alert. If it is a false positive, we close it, but we should document why it was considered benign. That documentation matters because repeated false positives can indicate that a detection rule needs tuning. If it is a true positive or there is enough suspicious activity to justify deeper investigation, we create a case. The case becomes the central record for the investigation. Depending on the organization, this could be managed in something like ServiceNow, The Hive, or another case management platform. The case should contain the original alert information, affected systems and accounts, relevant IP addresses, investigation timeline, collected evidence, analyst queries, screenshots or artifacts when appropriate, decisions that were made, containment actions, and eventually the final classification. There is a very simple principle I like here. Another analyst should be able to open your case halfway through the investigation and understand what happened without having to call you and ask what you were doing. That becomes especially important in a SOC operating across multiple shifts. Now we need to talk about playbooks. A playbook provides standardized response guidance for a particular type of security scenario. Instead of expecting every analyst to remember every investigation step, we document the expected process. Take phishing as an example. A phishing playbook might tell the analyst to validate the sender address and domain, analyze the email headers, extract and defang suspicious URLs, check those indicators against threat intelligence, analyze suspicious attachments in a sandbox, search for additional recipients, determine whether anyone clicked the link, and then decide whether containment or user notification is required. The important point is that the playbook guides the human analyst. It reduces guesswork and helps make investigations more consistent, particularly for junior analysts or analysts working under pressure. Then we have runbooks. The terminology can vary slightly between organizations and products, but in the context we're using here, think of a runbook as the automated implementation of repeatable workflow steps through a SOAR platform. Instead of asking the analyst to manually perform every enrichment action, the SOAR platform can perform some of them automatically. For example, imagine a phishing alert arrives. The automation can extract the URL from the email, submit it to threat intelligence services, detonate an attachment in a sandbox, search the environment for other recipients, check whether users interacted with the message, enrich the alert with those results, and create or update the investigation case. By the time the analyst opens the alert, much of the repetitive data collection may already be complete. That is one of the major advantages of SOAR. Automation should not necessarily replace analyst judgment. It should remove repetitive work so analysts can spend more time making decisions that actually require human reasoning. The next part of the workflow is escalation. Not every alert should immediately be sent to a senior analyst. If Tier 1 escalates everything that looks slightly unusual, Tier 2 and Tier 3 analysts become overwhelmed and the tier model stops working. But the opposite problem is equally dangerous. If analysts hesitate to escalate serious activity, an attacker can remain in the environment longer while the case is being handled at the wrong level. That is why escalation criteria should be clearly defined. For example, escalation might be required when a critical asset is affected, when a privileged account appears compromised, when we see lateral movement across multiple systems, when persistence has been established, when ransomware behavior appears, when data exfiltration is suspected, or when the potential business or regulatory impact becomes significant. Escalation can also happen simply because the investigation has moved beyond the analyst's authority or technical scope. The important thing is that escalation should follow defined criteria rather than depending entirely on whether an individual analyst personally feels that something looks serious. Eventually, the investigation reaches closure. And closing an investigation is not just clicking resolved on a ticket. Before closure, the analyst should confirm the final classification. Was this a true positive, a false positive, or was the evidence ultimately inconclusive? We also need to verify the scope. Did we identify all affected systems and accounts? Were the required containment actions completed? Was remediation confirmed? Relevant evidence should be preserved according to organizational policy, particularly if the incident may have legal, compliance, or regulatory implications. We should also document the root cause where possible and identify any follow-up work that still needs to happen. And this leads directly into continuous improvement. Every investigation produces information that can make the SOC better. If an alert repeatedly turns out to be a false positive, maybe the detection logic needs tuning. If analysts discover malicious activity that was not detected automatically, we may have identified a detection gap. If analysts repeatedly perform the same enrichment steps manually, that might be a good candidate for SOAR automation. So the workflow does not really end when the ticket is closed. The findings from investigations should feed back into detection engineering, rule tuning, playbook updates, automation, and analyst training. Over time, that should produce better quality alerts, less unnecessary analyst work, and faster response to genuine threats. So, the key idea from this lesson is that effective security operations are not just about having good security tools. You need a repeatable process connecting those tools and the people using them. Telemetry becomes detections. Detections become alerts. Alerts are prioritized and triaged. Suspicious activity becomes an investigation. Playbooks guide analysts. Runbooks and SOAR automate repeatable work. Escalation moves cases to the appropriate level, and case management preserves the entire investigation history. Then, after the investigation is closed, The findings go back into the SOC. So the next detection and investigation can be better than the previous one. In the next lesson, we'll move into continuous monitoring concepts and look at how SOC teams maintain visibility across endpoints, identities, networks, cloud environments, applications, and security infrastructure throughout the threat lifecycle.